Thank you, Anne. I'd like to also thank you for your tireless dedication to the cause that this conference is focused on, and to the Hudson Institute. And I'm just honored to join the august line of speakers that I'm humbled to be a part of. I have to tell you, after watching this drivel coming out of Ahmadinejad, it was pretty interesting to see that, I think one of the things that we get sucked into is one of the interesting things of demagogues is that they try to get you to waste time with their psychopathology. And I think one of the things you have to realize that he is but a symptom. There are people behind him that wrote that speech, there are governments behind him that support him, and there's an international infrastructure that is part of the ideology that he represents. And I think we do ourselves a disservice we should spend some time in analyzing the behaviors of the UN personnel that didn't leave when they should have, looking at our stances for ideologies, but we also do ourselves a disservice by focusing too much. My grandfather used to tell me, when your teacher points to the moon, the idiot looks at the finger. And, it's interesting that we have to look at exactly what they're doing. And again, no offense to some of the people that may have been part of the No Child Left Behind policies in the educational system, but it seems like the UN has turned into their principle is no dictator left behind. But at the end of the day, I will tell you that, and kudos to Hudson for having some diversity. I completely feel for some of the pain that Wafa talks about, but I come to this as somebody that loves my faith, has a close relationship with God, believes in and adores my scripture, but believes that it's been hijacked and manipulated and misinterpreted by a significant number of people that have influenced some of those that have been the leader. I think we have a crisis in leadership, not only in nations, but among the Islamic world, as far as clerics and imams are concerned. But this is something that's my problem, that's our problem as Muslims, and what I'd like you to leave here with is looking at what our solutions can be. Today is important because we come together as activists, as free thinkers and leaders in various communities that come together to step forward with one voice to remind our government and remind the UN that we have a duty to our fellow man to protect the sanctity of human rights, and that Israel for too long has been the canary in the coal mine in dealing not only with anti-Semitism and hate towards the Jewish people, but with racism and with the indignities of being targeted by significantly large, powerful regimes that may exist whether in Germany or across the world. The Durban process has made a mockery of human rights and has made a mockery of our responsibility as human beings. It is imperative, though, to view the Durban process from its roots from which it sprang. Its declaration in the UN website for Durban I said, you need to ask some questions that the UN organizations need to ask of their societies. Is it sufficiently inclusive? Is it non-discriminatory? Are its norms of behavior based on the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It makes you wonder if these organizations applied those questions to the Durban process itself. 10 years after what they opened will go down in history as one of the most blatant anti-Semitic, anti-Israel demonstrations that have happened under the auspices of the UN. But lost was another opportunity to lift up what I believe Eleanor Roosevelt was well-intentioned in building in the UN was the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But because of political correctness, because of multiculturalism, we've become so watered down that we no longer take sides on the most important questions of the day. So by not taking sides, we end up taking the side of the lowest common denominator, which are the dictators and the thugs of the world. With these despotic countries at the helm in Durban, the UN's Human Rights Commission has become, if it wasn't already, a farce. And ultimately, they use conspiracy theories, they use, again, anti-Semitism as one symptom to control their people in propaganda and brainwashing so that they cannot achieve their own personal individual rights. And they use it as a shackle on the necks of their people. And I think ultimately the Durban process has fostered a loss of faith in the so-called UN commitment to human rights and racial equality. If there's one thing that the Arab Spring has shown, and I know some people don't like calling it a spring, but truly it's been some unbelievable changes, the problem is will it lead to an Islamist winter? It has shown our communities, for example, my own identities, whether my Syrian, Arabic, or Muslim identity, is that we can repair our own condition. We can stop blaming our condition on others, on the boogeyman that the propagandists want to create. And that once left to our own devices and our own consciousness, and we repair our own, we will ultimately find the best form of growth in our individuality. I so wish my grandfather, who fought for freedom after the French pulled out of Syria, was alive to see, because what was happening today. As much as it pains me to see all the death happening and innocent civilians being shot in the streets on a daily basis in Syria, I still think ultimately it's a sign of good things happening as they try to shed the yoke of oppression from their own there. And it's interesting that if you look at, as you hear some of the pundits in the media, you hear them say, well, we lost an ally in Mubarak, and certainly there was a peace treaty with Israel. But I can't tell you enough how much that ally was a mirage. It was a facade. It may have been a military peace, but ideologically, the protocols of the Elders of Zion that were handed out at Durban II, I believe, are shown on Egyptian TV under Mubarak every year during Ramadan. A lot of the virulent anti-Semitism that we've heard so many people talking about was used by dictators and indoctrinated into their people so that they could create this Machiavellian enemy that they ultimately would create an unstable, chaotic society that allowed them to maintain dictatorship and totalitarian regimes. And now, because of this beast that they've created of Islamism, and as these dictators leave, Durban's also evolving into a complaint about Islamophobia. And that crying wolf, by exploiting the very important concept of xenophobia or racism, is attempting basically to use this concept of Islamophobia to end free speech and make any commentary against strains of Islam equated with hate speech. And on a daily basis, just go to Ahmadinejad's Press TV and see what their TV puts out, where Islamist organizations, even from the U.S., use it as a platform, and even some of our Democratic Party arms, like the Center for American Progress, has produced a so-called research report, which was far from it, that identified how America has become Islamophobic. And even the Dalai Lama was co-opted this month in Montreal to sign a declaration with Islamists like Tariq Ramadan at the Second World Conference on World Religions after 9/11, in which they equated criticism of Islam or any religion with hate speech, which basically immunizes religion from criticism. And in the Orthodox Islam in which I was raised, I was told that you have to be free to reject God in order to be faithful. You have to be free to reject your scripture in order to prove that you accept it. So therefore, this is a struggle within the House of Islam. It's not a struggle, as much as these dictators want to make it to be a struggle between Islam and Muslims and everybody else, it's one within the House of Islam. And we just need to have the political will and the moral courage to take sides. And I think Israel has been dealing with this as a canary in the coal mine and dealing with radical Islamism in the West Bank and in Gaza and elsewhere through the symptom of terrorism that was a byproduct of that ideological fuel. And we could learn a lot about the moral steadfastness of a democracy and how it deals with ideological threats. And this is the agenda not only of certain countries, but of the entire organization of the Islamic Conference. A cabal of Muslim dictators, monarchs, and autocrats who use Western principles when it serves them, but internally within their own nations they rule with an iron fist. And as a Muslim who loves my faith, I've devoted so much of my work to the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in order to expose the fact that the only way that the Arab Spring will work is if they separate mosque and state. And believe me, you may not be hearing many of these voices, but there are many Muslims. There were secularists marching in Tunisia with signs that say, we want to separate mosque and state. There are many large movements that exist. The problem is they've not been fueled with petrodollars. They've not been fueled with Islamist countries like Qatar that has the benefit of fueling a propaganda arm like Al Jazeera that has fueled quite a bit of Islamism around the world. Their influence on the UN has turned it into purely an apologist for tyrants. I believe Eleanor Roosevelt will be rolling over in her grave. The OIC, interestingly, did not sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It signed the Cairo Declaration, which was based on interpretations of Sharia, interpretations of blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, and elsewise. And this is, I think, when we should have defunded the UN. was when you had a majority of the countries refusing to sign the UN Declaration or Universal Declaration, but they signed a declaration that's an anathema to the principles that my family came to the West to enjoy. And this would have made a statement in the early 90s about really the UN has principles or we're not going to be a part of it. But unfortunately, it's more about catering to dictators. The Cairo Declaration empowered apostasy, misogynistic laws, anti-religious freedom laws, and to this day we're still fighting the power and influence of the 56 countries that are part of the OIC. I'm offended by the fact that Durban III is taking place here near Ground Zero, in the town in which we were attacked by the byproduct of the ideologies that have come out of radical Islamism around the world. And as a result, rather than recognize that byproduct and something we need to treat as a United Nations, we are forced to hear and listen to lectures from psychopathic leaders. And as our nation revisited and commemorated the 10-year anniversary, it's interesting to hear Navi Pillay say that the precise facts surrounding the killing of bin Laden so that she can see if our free nation respected international law. So she had the audacity to actually talk about the rights of bin Laden. And she sat on her hands for months while innocent Syrians have been killed in the street week after week after week. This is not a United Nations with principle. It's a United Nations that is set up to endorse and transmit conspiracy theories and basically anti-Western, anti-liberal democracy principles. And I would agree with the eminent Elie Wiesel, who said not only that Ahmadinejad should have been arrested, but Assad actually spoke to the UN and said, there is a distinction between terrorism and the struggle for rights of self-determination by people under foreign occupation and colonial or alien domination, unquote. Assad said that. I mean, this man is a liar. And yet you have the head of the UN saying, a month ago he said, I can't believe he lied to me and he continued to use force in the Syrian streets. I mean, any Syrian breathing could tell you that the Assad family is born liars and some of the most barbaric, dishonest individuals that have ruled any government since Hitler. But basically his statement sums up the corruption underlying those radicals and thugs that blame the West and use the UN to divert attention from their own thuggery. And just as the Muslim Brotherhood has organizations that infuse and try to co-opt Western systems, the UN is being co-opted by many of these systems in a similar type of exploitative way where they use our freedoms against us. The saddest thing is that in this time in the Middle East, there's been no time, I think, that the UN's mandate could have been easier and more clear, and with so many nations clamoring for freedom. It could have been standing at the precipice of greatness, but at the end, without any moral courage, most of us are losing faith in an era of lost faith. We sat idly by while secular fascists Mubarak and Assad and initially Saddam Hussein seized the reins throughout the Arab world and came to embrace the mirage of security. And ultimately, it was not a security. They were fueling and festering underneath the surface these ideologies that now we're going to be forced to deal with. And we're going to need to have leaders domestically, not only at the UN, but domestically that can deal with that and that have the wherewithal to identify the ideologies that we stand for and the ideologies that we stand against, even if it camouflages itself within a religion. Because if we don't counter that, it will ultimately continue to spread and hegemonize the Middle East and the world. And we cannot allow it to use scapegoats to divert our attention. And that's what anti-Semitism is. That's what the State of Israel has dealt with. It has become a scapegoat for dictators to continue to try to avoid the criticism of the free world. But yet the Arab Spring has not seemed to have reached the Palestinian community. There sadly has been no demonstrations in the streets against the oppression and the hate of Hamas, no demonstrations to actually change their documents, their charters, that are some of the most anti-Semitic documents you could read. So how can they have the respect of somebody that, or a group of people that deserve a state? The Palestinians will never treat and I think never achieve the respect of even asking for a state until they get to the real root causes of their own oppression, which is the ideologies of radical Islamism from which their endemic anti-Semitism arises. The UN has been missing in action when its leadership and sponsorship of democratic values has been needed the most. Worse, in many ways, the inaction and delay at the UN has stifled the response of the United States, Britain, and many other Western democracies, which have held out hope that the Russians and the Chinese would respond to some of the killing going on in Syria. And I'll tell you, I think it's important, and I know I've spent some time on this, but as an American of Syrian origin, to see what the UN has not done there just exemplifies how useless of an organization it has become. And I think this is where Muslims can come together with Jews who've been persecuted by institutions like the UN that have propagated anti-Semitic and given platforms for anti-Semitism, and realize that these institutions, if they're immoral, are not going to show it just in one area. They're going to show it across the board whenever they're tested on their moral strength. I would submit that there is nothing which hurts our national security more in the long run and damaging our reputation for the genuine advocacy of religious freedom and passively allowing those who are an anathema to religious freedom to gain the mantle of leadership throughout the Middle East. The hatred and bigotry against Israel that we see today is nothing compared to what could lay ahead if we allow the Islamists or even other secular fascists to assume control in the newly liberated countries. Prime Minister Cameron said it best when he talked about us needing a muscular liberalism. Instead, the UN seems to have a muscular despotism. Did we not learn from the lessons of 9/11? I think it's time to tell the UN that they either reboot their principles or we start to take away significant amounts of funding. And it's time to listen to the masses. The streets in Egypt and Libya and Bahrain and Yemen and Syria have done, without the UN, have been able to change some of their governments. And they're on the precipice, hopefully, of progress. They may take some steps back before they take it forward. But ultimately, we cannot abandon those changes and depend on the UN. We do need a muscular liberalism. And there are solutions out there to the problem. Our own organization has a Muslim Liberty Project where we take Muslim youth and build with them through retreats the ability to identify with Western ideas as part of their identity, and not in conflict with being Muslim or our scripture, and reforming the ideas in our scripture that conflict with Western freedom and universal human rights. We've also formed an American Islamic Leadership Coalition that are a number of leaders in Canada and the U.S. that stand against Islamism, that have formed alternatives to the Muslim Brotherhood network in the West, and I think can become laboratories for what we could export back to the countries of our motherland so that they can build the nidus of a future Middle East that is based in secular liberal democracy. Because history has shown it's wise to take sides in these battles against dictators, despots, and theocrats, because ultimately democracies, true democracies, will not fight wars against one another. The Arab Spring is about change, and we've heard about change in elections here in the United States. The UN needs to change by redefining its guiding principles and leading the world's nations toward respecting the sanctity of universal human rights. And I've been doing the work I have because I felt that knowing the values that my grandfather instilled in me and what he tried to do in Syria and ultimately was in and out of prison and then left there and came to the U.S., that this is the only way to do it is by persistent tenaciousness, just like Anne has done in this organization and what you're doing. So finally, I think it's time for us to help build institutions and freedom movements forward in the Middle East, in Muslim consciousness, in the Arabic consciousness, because that ultimately will make the UN even more irrelevant than it is today. Thank you.